Good day, folks. Thanks for coming to Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I am Matthew Brown, and your host here at Madison 365. Please hit subscribe. You can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, of course. Thanks for coming today. I hope you're all doing well, all things considered. Election day is coming up. I hope you have a plan to vote if you haven't already. Please vote. We got to get this sucker out of here. A little bit on that. Well, not exactly on that. But today I'm going to be talking a bit about interesting combination of the myth-ish of racial progress, as well as the intersection of race and class, which both deserve dissertations of their own, and I'm sure there's plenty out there. But this is a interesting topic, and I alluded to it a little bit in Cap Time's Idea Fest on panel I was had, basically around protest and progress and change. If you'd like to see it, some other great panelists, particularly M. Adams and Douglas McLeod from UW. He's a professor there, and M. Adams of Freedom Inc. So if you're interested, head on over to Cap Time's Idea Fest. It was really good. But there was a question on there I'd like to expand upon a little bit, specifically around, well, racial progress and progress in the United States. And I made the assertion that we haven't made as much progress as we'd like to think we have. Well, there's been some substantial changes and substantial work. We haven't made the progress that we think we had. And let's think of this a little bit of as a lifespan of sorts, right? It is substantive and substantial for a child to first start walking and running, but they are far from grown at that point. It is substantial for a child to start talking and reading, but they are far from learned at that point. That is effectively kind of the stage where we're at, as well as I don't want to downplay this at all. And the emancipation, the ending of chattel slavery was absolutely massive and substantial in this country. Chattel slavery is a very unique horror, and we need to look at it as such. I keep saying this. I'll definitely do a cast specifically on chattel slavery and exploring it, and a bit about what that means. But that the ending of that was substantial. I'm not just talking about the Civil War. I'm just specifically in the context of itself. The ending of chattel slavery was a substantial and a big step. But this is where the myth of racial progress really comes in. In one, we haven't made as much progress as we like to think we have. And two, the progress we've made has not been linear at all. And these things definitely intertwine a bit too, as far as definitely that myth. So the ending of chattel slavery, definitely talked about this before, and heading into Reconstruction, and it took a lot of will from the federal government to even get as far in Reconstruction as we did. But there was a very real overthrow of Reconstruction, and this was a absolutely violent overthrow. I've talked about this before. And particularly when you want to get into the convict lease programs, where people that were locked up oftentimes on just BS laws, these are vagrancy laws, people, spitting on the sidewalk or being passed out, basically out too late. Just down the line of bogus laws would often then be leased out to the very same plantations, oftentimes, not all the time, but still a plantation nonetheless, and worked on those. And these are people that were newly freed being locked up again and working on the same plantations. Now we still have prison labor, which is very close and analogous to slave labor. It is slave labor in a real sense. And we still have that. That's a legacy of Jim Crow era of convict release programs. Like that's what prison labor is, and that goes up all the way to today, right? So that legacy still lives with is a present when it comes to institutions that quickly rose up to replace chattel slavery, to reinforce our racial caste system. There were other types of indentured servitude going on where folks basically had to, saw this with, why am I blanking out? The farmers, the agricultural folks, when they sharecroppers, boom, there we go, sharecroppers, right? Was basically indentured servitude, and people were targeted for that, and there are different forms of that as well. And we had children being taken away from their parents, and of course violent militias or violent terrorist groups, white terrorist groups, going around and killing black folks and reinforcing this racial caste system. And then we had professionalization of police and the growth of the drug war and this effectual policing of black bodies in a colonial relationship type of way, where there, as long as black people stayed in their black neighborhoods, those black neighborhoods, predominantly lower income and even middle class black neighborhoods are basically like lower class white neighborhoods economically. And so you have an occupational relationship with police and basically a colonial relationship with police. These steps aren't too far removed from chattel slavery. Now, while the growth, again, has been substantial, it hasn't been great, particularly when you look at certain material changes and disparities. Wealth since the 1960s for Black Americans has basically stayed flat, hasn't grown. Well, the wealth gap has absolutely grown. Educational attainment has grown, but educational gaps are still here and actually quite massive. According to Economic Policy Institute, EPI, African Americans today are much better educated than they were in 1968. More than 90% of African Americans ages 25 to 29 have graduated from high school, compared to just over half in 1968, which means they nearly close the gap with white graduation rates. But they're also more than twice as likely to have college degrees in 1968, but are still half as likely as young whites to have college degrees. Wages have increased, but African Americans still make 82.5 cents on every dollar from white workers. And African Americans are 2.5 times as likely to be in poverty as whites, with the median white family having almost 10 times as much wealth as black families. The typical black family had almost no wealth in 1968. About $2,000. It's a little over $10,000, depending on exactly where you look. The range is between around $10,000 to $17,000 in wealth. And actually, the last few years, black wealth has actually declined a little bit as well. And, infant mortality. Black infant mortality rates have gone down and have been better overall. But in relative terms, Black infant mortality rates have fallen quite behind. 1968, Black infants were 1.9 times as likely to die as white infants. Today, that rate is 2.3 times higher. Now, and then we look at home ownership. Home ownership for Black families is barely higher than it was in 1968. It was 41.1% in 1968 and 41.2%. This was in 2016, and I'm sure it has decreased, particularly since COVID since then. Over the same period of time, white households increased 5.2 percentage points to 71.1%, about 30% points higher than the ownership for Black households. And then we look at other things. The Voting Rights Act, right, which was one of the only pieces of legislation that explicitly put racially disparate outcomes as more important than explicitly racist intent. And there's been a whole codification of laws that create racially disparate outcomes. But this is really where dog whistle politics have come in. But they don't put out front this, explicit racial intent, or at least publicly, right? And this is where voter suppression laws really come in, with the Roberts Court over basically taking out and undercutting key provisions of the civil right of the Voting Rights Act, made it so that states could implement these voter ID laws and voter suppression laws that really are explicitly designed to suppress votes, particularly Democratic votes, particularly voters of color, lower income and elderly votes, and youth votes. Basically, people that are more likely to vote for Democrats than Republicans. There's no substantial evidence of voter fraud. Now, there's growing evidence of election fraud by the GOP. We see this in California and elsewhere. But voter fraud, nah. You can find some individual cases here and there, but outliers are outliers, and they're very small individual cases that have no impact on elections. So we've seen a rollback of one of the strongest pieces of legislation go through Congress within the Voting Rights Act. We've seen a rollback of affirmative action, which also how it was implemented impacted white women more than anybody else. And along with that, there's been really no wide, strong initiatives that have been even at the level of anything like we saw with the funding of our prison industrial complex and our police state in combating the really real world material conditions that Black and brown folks live in. And this goes, and then you start wrapping in everything when it comes to the prison industrial complex. And so you start creating this picture of Black Americans really aren't economically or materially that much improved since the 1960s. A lot of folks like to put this on Black Americans, but again, this is that gets into some really real racist territory, particularly when we look at how there's massive discrimination in home ownership, in bank lending when it comes to particularly home ownership, in housing valuation, lots of racist practices there, racist practices in hiring, in pay, just down the line in both institutional and individualized racism in these types of things. Down the line. So it creates a really tough picture to talk about progress. There's really minimal progress in a large sense. We've made some substantial changes, but we're trying to get grown, right? We're trying to grow, but we're stuck in infancy. We're stuck in our really formative years in K through 5, right? We keep repeating the same grade over and over again with pushback, right? With really real pushback, and Black Americans fighting every step of the way. And it's not for a lack of will on Black Americans to fight or to even work hard. And some of these myths are in there, really real stuff. Like when you talk about broken families, well, according to a CDC study, Black fathers are more engaged with their families and more involved in their kids' lives than any other racial group. Maybe Black families might be a little bit more non-traditional, but their Black fathers are very much engaged in their kids' lives. And that's before we even get into the fact of how the criminal justice system likes to break up Black families. So marriage isn't even an indicator of a strong family, familiar unit, particularly when we want to talk about more communal type of raising. We know plenty of families that with parents that should get divorced and be better off getting divorced, or fathers that are barely there for their kids. Just because they have a marriage doesn't mean they're better off. But this is also where an interesting aspect of economics comes in, because there's this loop, a self-feeding cycle that make it hard to create class solidarity. And actually, hold on, let me step back a little bit. These disparities are real. But the disparities also pale in comparison when we look at class disparities. So income disparities are real, but the average white worker is much closer economically to the average black worker than they are to wealthy folks. We're talking about the wealthiest handful have more wealth than the poorest 150 million folks. Wealth is concentrated into the hands of very few folks, predominantly rich white men. Just absolutely mind-bogglingly wealthy. And heck, even millionaires are closer in relationship to folks like us than they are to billionaires. I mean, these folks have an obscene amount of wealth. But race and class, race is used as a wedge issue to help maintain this class divide. It's very real. And this is where you have folks like Bernie Sanders that jump in and talk about, we need to focus on class and not race. And there's even some other black folks that talk about this as well. And focusing on economic justice is absolutely important. It's economic justice is also a racial justice argument in a sense. But there are some real things that impact Black Americans that don't impact white Americans, at least not as much. But it's a real thing, and King even said as much. And there's and we have to get this control under economic justice. It's a real thing. MLK said to Harry Belafonte shortly before he was assassinated, "We have fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have, and I know that we will win. But I've come to believe we're integrating into a burning house. I'm afraid that America may be losing what moral vision she may have had. And I'm afraid that even as we integrate, we are walking into a place that does not understand that this nation needs to be deeply concerned with the plight of the poor and disenfranchised. Until we commit ourselves to ensuring that the underclass is given justice and opportunity, we will continue to perpetuate the anger and violence that tears at the soul of this nation." Race is part of that, though, and he, there's a lot of subtext to the disenfranchised, but race is part of this. Race is absolutely part of this, and it's used as a wedge issue. Because as soon as you inject race into those that want to focus on class, they say, hold your roll. Let's focus on class first, then we'll address race. But why does race need to wait? You had folks like Bernie Sanders talking, political revolution and massive changes, and we need these, big things, Medicare for all, woo, woo, woo. And I'm down for that. Let's do that. But why was he so tepid on reparations? Which is also a massive economic issue. And if we're talking about a raising tide lifts all boats, reparation lifts all boats. It increases wealth and holdings for Black America, which increases property value, improves spending power, all sorts of just down the line. It's a massive investment in wealth and economic opportunities, which should raise all boats, should it not? But there's even more here to it. Again, it's this revolution for me, but not for you. Why does race have to wait? And why should, packages that address very specific things to race or ethnicities, immigration policies, ending ICE, and, tearing apart the Department of Homeland Security, easing up other immigration policies. We're talking about, as well as this is both a class and race issue when it comes to immigrant workers that are non-citizens being paid lower wages, among many other things. Not getting, workers' protections, healthcare. These are real things. And then we want to take even a look at our healthcare system and disparate not just access to insurance, but things that access to insurance won't fix, such as doctors believing, something like 80% of Black doctors believe Black people have a higher pain tolerance than white people. An alarming number of doctors, forget the exact statistic, but believe Black people have thicker skin. Disparate types of care. Serena Williams, a world-class athlete, almost died giving birth because the doctors and nurses weren't taking her seriously when she was saying something was wrong. These are real things. Or again, when we want to go to banking and home devaluation on, Black homeowners having their homes valued, $100,000, less in some instances, where then they take down the pictures of their black family, and then somebody goes in to evaluate their home without the black homeowner there, and what do you know? All of a sudden it's valued more. Or inability to get, loans and discrimination practices there. What about that? Again, that's an economic issue that impacts Black Americans in a way that doesn't impact white Americans, but it's an economic issue as much as it is a race issue. Not to mention, if we end discrimination in housing valuation and lending, white folks' property will be valued better and help end white flight in some real ways. Now, people leaving because they don't like Black people is a different issue, but is a self-feeding cycle. And so that there's some people that would like to stay in a sense, but they put their own individual interests over that of kind of a community feed of white flight because their home is valued a little less because a Black family moved in or more Black families are moving in. So then the property value of the neighborhood gets pushed down because Black home, valuation is lower, and it creates this feeding cycle. So if we end that evaluation, a white homeowner in a mixed race neighborhood, and let's be real, right now we're the most segregated we've been since 1968. If you're a white homeowner, you're probably living in a majority white neighborhood, but your home is going to be, worth more in a mixed race neighborhood if we end this devaluation. That's a real economic issue that lifts all boats. These things aren't mutually exclusive. We can do these large, more race blind, color blind, or everybody kind of stuff, Medicare for all, and other, you're talking about, free college, reinvestment in public schools. These are real things. But one, we need more Black teachers, and that's not, reinvestment in public schools isn't going to end some of the education disparities. Guaranteeing housing isn't going to end some of the education disparities because of some of the racism within our education system, and particularly the lack of Black and brown teachers, which absolutely impacts academic performance. I mean, a Black teacher, before you hit, what was it, like ninth grade or something like that, improves your chances of graduating high school by 30%. One Black teacher in your formative years increases a Black student's graduation rate by 30%. That's massive. Integration got rid of a lot of Black teachers. Who integrated with who? So there's not been that much progress. And there's this self-feeding cycle that of particularly folks that this class analysis folks, white socialists and communists and social democrats, particularly white folks, not, it's a little less of a problem with those that identify as social democrats that are people of color and Black, but sometimes it's a problem. So why not both? Why can't we do both at the same time? Do a reparations package, right? Bernie Sanders was so tepid on reparations. He wanted to study it first, yet didn't want to study Medicare for all, universal basic income, these things that he got behind so easily. He was tepid on reparations. Well, let's wrap in reparations in these larger economic reforms. Revolution for all of us. All right? These can make massive differences and really, lift the tides of a lot of folks. Truth and reconciliation wrapped into this, wrapped into larger economic reforms, breaking up the banks, down the line, raising a federal minimum wage, down the line. These things are, as economic issues just as much as they are racial issues. You can't untwine these things. We have to address them at the same time. But what this is coming upon is particularly on white people to have the willpower to see these things through, to not be so scared of revolution around things and race, to be part of that, to see themselves in seeing how in that, in a sense. And that it lifts their boat. If raising tides lifts all boat, let's do that. Let's do that. It shouldn't be a yes and, or it should be a yes and. It shouldn't be an either or. And too often times it's looked as an either or. There's plenty of folks, I should say, that also have a race analysis that don't have a class analysis. They will explore ad nauseum the difficulty they have in, Black professors in academic spaces, but won't properly explore why majority of hotel workers are Black and brown and how that, impacts their livelihood and the economics of that and the class aspects of that. might be too focused on, yeah. Before I get going on another tangent, we'll kind of start wrapping that up here. But these things need to be intertwined, and that's how we make the real change, because there's real economic and material conditions that are impacting Black Americans that have not been substantially addressed in real ways. As long as we make symbolic gestures, or not just symbolic. I mean, the Voting Rights Act is not symbolic, but if we focus on some of these other conditions that aren't impacting real world economic and material conditions of Black livelihood and Black families, we'll be stuck in this cycle. And the last question was interesting on the panel, because it said, do you think the United States has a will to see its progress? And it's not on Black people. Black people have been fighting for these things since hit these shorts and chains, fighting for freedom. It's incumbent upon white people. Do they have the will to fight for their own freedom? In a sense that this means that there will be issues that will be addressed that aren't directly centering them. So don't get uneasy when issues of race are injected. Don't push back. Bring it in, invite it in, and let's explore those things. And we have to work through that, right? White folks, you got to work through that. But we got to work through this together in a real way. We're tied in this together, and this is a burning house. And we have to have the moral fortitude and the will to see these things through. But that is it for today. Thank you for coming to Finding the Warmth of Our Sun here at Madison 365. Don't forget to hit subscribe, YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. Thank you for joining us. Socially distance, wear a mask, and get your butt out to vote so we can get rid of this sucker in the White House. But enough of that. Have yourself a good day, a good week. Thanks for coming.
This is 365 Media.